you've got millions of illegals and you don't know where they're coming from, they're waving flags from foreign countries and assaulting police officers and law enforcement officers, that's a problem.
The laws of the United States?
No, the governor of California is unable to execute the laws of the United States. The governor of the California has failed to protect his people, along with the mayor of Los Angeles. And so President Trump has said...
Mr. Chair, I want to express my severe concern with the deployment of the National Guard in Los Angeles without consultation of the state of California. There have been photographs that have shown these troops sleeping on the floor and have not been provided fuel, food, or water by DOD. How long will this deployment last, and why were we unprepared to provide them basic necessities such as food and water?
The commanders and troops on the field are very well prepared, sir. They responded incredibly rapidly to a deteriorating situation with equipment and capabilities. We have made sure from the top down, as a Secretary of Defense who's been in a unit holding riot shields outside the White House during the chaos of the summer of 2020. I know what it's like to be immediately deployed into a situation like that. There are moments where you may do as best you can temporarily, but we are ensuring they're housed, fed, water capabilities in real time from my office, because I care that much about the California Guard and the Marines and men and women who are supporting our ICE agents on the ground. It's true every day, and that's a disingenuous attack that misrepresents how much we care about our troops and what they're doing to defend ICE agents. I'm not going to take the fact that we don't care about the troops. Nobody cares more about the troops at the top than this secretary and the chairman of our department.
How long will the deployment last?
We stated very publicly that it's 60 days. Because we want to ensure that those rioters, looters, and thugs on the other side assaulting our police officers know we're not going anywhere. We're here to maintain the peace on behalf of law enforcement officers in Los Angeles, which Gavin Newsom won't do.
What is the estimated cost of the deployment for the Guard and the Marines to LA, and where's the funding coming from? Will it be coming from quality of life programs that affect our service members or our families? If you want to wait till I finish.
Before I hand it to
such as updates, housing and barracks.
Before I hand it to Bryn, the insinuation that we're pulling money from housing and barracks in order to fund this is disingenuous and incorrect. Bryn can give you the numbers, absolutely.
So the current
With the most recent deployment of the Marines, Mr. Secretary, what's the justification for using the military for civilian law enforcement purposes in LA? Why are you sending war fighters to cities to interact with civilians?
Every American citizen deserves to live in a community that's safe, and ICE agents need to be able to do their job. They're being attacked for doing their job, which is deporting illegal criminals. That should happen in any city, Minneapolis or Los Angeles. And if they're attacked, that's lawless. President Trump believes in law and order. So he has every authority, and he has done mobilizing National Guard or active duty troops under U.S. code to protect federal agents in their job, which is exactly what we're doing, and we're proud to do it. We're proud to do it.
10 U.S.C. of the U.S. Code 12406 as a legal basis that the president used cites 3 examples and circumstances for the Guard. Invasion by a foreign nation, rebellion or dangerous rebellion against the authority of the government of the United States, or the president is unable with regular forces to execute the laws of the United States. Which authority is triggered here to justify the use?
I don't know. You just read it yourself, and people can listen themselves, but it sounds like all 3 to me. If you've got millions of illegals and you don't know where they're coming from, they're waving flags from foreign countries and assaulting police officers and law enforcement officers, that's a problem.
The laws of the United States?
No, the governor of California is unable to execute the laws of the United States. The governor of the California has failed to protect his people, along with the mayor of Los Angeles, and so President Trump has said he will protect our agents, and our Guard and Marines are proud to do it.
The law also says, Mr. Secretary, that the orders for these purposes shall be issued through governors of the states.
You and I both know that President Trump has all the authorities necessary, and thankfully he's willing to do it on behalf of citizens of Los Angeles, on behalf of our ICE agents, and behalf of our country.
We've also pulled $1 billion for the border as well, so this just goes into the same funding coming in.
Congressman, what's the...
I was asking Mr. McDonald. $134 million goes on top of $1 billion.
If a city refuses to enforce the law, then someone eventually has to ask whether leadership has become theater instead of responsibility. That was the line that immediately changed the tone of the conversation. And if you watched the exchange closely, you could almost feel the room pause for a moment, because statements like that do not usually appear in polite political discussions. Some viewers later asked why a remark like that sounded so sharp, almost confrontational, especially when the debate involved two experienced political figures who both understood the sensitivity of the issue being discussed. The reason is simple, and it becomes clearer the longer you watch the exchange unfold, because the disagreement between Pete Hegseth and Hillary Clinton was never really about one narrow policy detail or one specific decision taken by the federal government. It was about two very different interpretations of leadership, authority, and the responsibility of government when public order, immigration enforcement, and political messaging collide in the same moment. My own view, watching the discussion develop from the perspective of someone who studies American political dynamics closely, is that the tension between those two approaches explains why the debate captured so much attention across political media. Pete Hegseth approached the issue as someone who frames national security through the lens of operational responsibility and direct accountability, while Hillary Clinton approached it from a long career of institutional diplomacy and strategic political messaging. Neither approach exists in a vacuum, and understanding the clash between them requires stepping back and examining the different assumptions that shape their political instincts. Hegseth often speaks the language of urgency and enforcement, while Clinton tends to emphasize institutional process, alliances, and long-term political stability. Those differences might sound abstract, but when the subject turns to immigration enforcement and federal authority, they become intensely practical very quickly. The debate that triggered this confrontation revolved around a familiar but deeply complicated question in American politics. When a city experiences sustained unrest or law enforcement agencies face violent resistance while attempting to enforce federal immigration law, who ultimately bears the responsibility for restoring order? Is it the local government that governs the city, the state leadership that oversees its law enforcement structure, or the federal government that carries the constitutional authority to enforce national law across all states? Those questions have existed for generations, but in modern politics they carry a new level of intensity because immigration enforcement has become one of the most politically polarizing subjects in the country. And once that topic enters a public hearing or televised debate, the conversation rarely stays technical for very long. The exchange that people began replaying online started with a relatively procedural line of questioning. Officials were discussing the decision to deploy federal support forces to stabilize conditions in a major American city following reports that federal immigration officers were facing direct interference while carrying out their duties. Critics of the deployment argued that the federal government had moved too quickly and had not sufficiently coordinated with state leadership before sending additional forces to the area. Supporters argued that federal officers cannot carry out their legal responsibilities if local governments refuse to cooperate or fail to maintain basic public safety conditions. And that disagreement set the stage for the confrontation between Hegseth's enforcement-focused philosophy and Clinton's institutional approach to federal authority. Hegseth framed his position in very direct language that reflected his broader political identity. He argued that when federal agents are assigned to enforce immigration law, they must be able to do so without facing intimidation or physical obstruction from violent groups. In his view, the responsibility of the federal government is straightforward in those circumstances because national law cannot depend on the willingness of individual cities or states to cooperate with enforcement efforts. If officers tasked with carrying out federal law are being attacked or prevented from doing their jobs, the federal government must respond with whatever resources are necessary to restore stability. From Hegseth's perspective, that principle is not controversial but foundational to the functioning of the constitutional system. Hillary Clinton approached the same situation from a different political angle that reflected decades of experience navigating federal institutions. Her argument did not deny that federal authorities possess the legal power to intervene when necessary, but she emphasized that exercising that authority requires careful coordination with state leadership to avoid escalating tensions. Clinton warned that rapid federal deployments without extensive consultation risk creating the impression that Washington is overriding local governance structures. That perception, she argued, can sometimes intensify political conflict instead of calming it, particularly in communities where immigration enforcement already carries significant emotional and cultural weight. In her view, leadership requires balancing enforcement with political judgment about how federal actions will be perceived by the public. Watching the debate unfold, it became clear that the disagreement was not simply about a single deployment decision. It reflected two competing philosophies about how leadership should operate when legal authority intersects with political volatility. Hegseth consistently emphasized action and responsibility, arguing that hesitation can allow instability to spread while officials debate procedural details. Clinton consistently emphasized process and legitimacy, arguing that actions taken without careful coordination can undermine public trust even when the legal authority behind them is clear. Both arguments contain elements of truth, which is precisely why the conversation resonated so widely beyond the immediate hearing room. One moment in particular captured the contrast between those two approaches. When critics questioned whether federal forces had been deployed too aggressively, Hegseth responded with a line that quickly circulated across social media discussions about the exchange. He argued that the real question was not whether federal officers had acted too decisively, but whether local leadership had done enough to prevent the situation from deteriorating in the first place. In other words, he reframed the conversation from one about federal overreach to one about local responsibility. That rhetorical move shifted the focus of the debate almost instantly. Clinton responded by cautioning that political rhetoric can sometimes simplify complicated governance challenges. She argued that cities often face complex social pressures during periods of unrest, and local leaders must manage those pressures while protecting constitutional rights and public safety simultaneously. Deploying federal forces, she suggested, should be a last resort rather than an immediate response whenever tensions escalate. Otherwise, the federal government risks appearing to substitute national authority for local governance rather than supporting it. Her comments reflected a broader philosophy that sees federal intervention as a delicate instrument rather than a default solution. The exchange did not end the debate, and in many ways it intensified it because each side believed the other was overlooking an essential principle. Supporters of Hegseth argued that federal law enforcement cannot function if local officials treat immigration policy as optional. Supporters of Clinton argued that federal authority must be exercised with caution in a federal system designed to balance national power with state autonomy. Those competing interpretations of responsibility form the core of the broader immigration enforcement debate in American politics today. And the clash between Pete Hegseth's direct enforcement rhetoric and Hillary Clinton's institutional caution captured that tension in a single moment. Before we go deeper into what happened next and why the debate escalated the way it did, there is an important question that viewers watching this discussion should consider carefully. If a city experiences escalating unrest while federal officers are attempting to enforce national law, should the federal government intervene immediately to restore order, or should it wait until state leadership formally requests assistance? That question sits at the center of the entire dispute between the perspectives represented by Hegseth and Clinton. And the answer to that question reveals a great deal about how each person understands the balance between authority, responsibility, and democratic accountability in the American system. So stay with me through the rest of this breakdown, because what happened next in the debate made those philosophical differences even clearer. What happened after that opening exchange is where the discussion truly began to reveal the deeper political instincts of both figures. Because once the initial shock of that blunt remark faded, the conversation moved into the territory where experience, ideology, and political strategy intersect. Pete Hegseth did not attempt to soften his position or walk back the implication that leadership sometimes requires acting decisively, even when critics are still debating the procedural details of that action. Instead, he leaned further into the argument that the core responsibility of government is to ensure that laws passed by Congress are actually enforceable in every part of the country, regardless of the political preferences of individual local governments. From his perspective, the debate over coordination and consultation risked distracting from a much simpler question that he believed the public understood instinctively. If federal officers cannot safely perform their duties in a city, then someone in authority has already failed before the first additional unit is deployed. Hillary Clinton responded in a manner that reflected decades of navigating exactly this type of political confrontation. Rather than arguing directly against the importance of enforcing federal law, she reframed the issue as one of proportionality and long-term governance. Clinton pointed out that the United States operates under a federal system precisely because the founders wanted to prevent the concentration of authority in a single level of government. That system requires constant negotiation between federal authority and state autonomy, especially when sensitive issues like immigration enforcement intersect with local community tensions. Her point was not that federal intervention is illegitimate, but that its legitimacy often depends on how and when it is exercised. For observers familiar with American political history, this exchange echoed debates that have appeared repeatedly over the last century. From civil rights enforcement in the 1960s to disaster response and National Guard deployments in more recent decades, the same underlying question resurfaces again and again. How quickly should the federal government act when local conditions deteriorate? And how much weight should be given to local leadership's assessment of the situation on the ground? Some leaders view decisive federal action as a demonstration of responsibility when local institutions appear overwhelmed. Others view it as a potentially destabilizing signal that Washington does not trust local governments to manage their own jurisdictions. Hegseth's reply to Clinton's argument revealed the philosophical core of his position in a way that many viewers later described as unusually direct. He argued that the problem with waiting for perfect coordination is that violent situations rarely pause long enough for political leaders to reach consensus about the correct procedural sequence. When federal officers are facing organized resistance while carrying out their duties, the priority, in his view, must be restoring order first and debating jurisdictional questions afterward. Hegseth framed this not as a partisan position, but as a practical one, rooted in the basic expectation that law enforcement cannot function under threat. In his view, hesitation in those moments risks signaling weakness rather than respect for institutional balance. Clinton countered by highlighting the political consequences that can follow when enforcement actions appear to ignore local leadership entirely. She argued that public perception plays a powerful role in whether federal intervention stabilizes a situation or inflames it further. Communities that already feel distrustful of federal authority may interpret sudden deployments as an attempt to impose control rather than restore order. That perception can sometimes strengthen the very resistance that enforcement actions are meant to suppress. For Clinton, the challenge of leadership is not only exercising authority, but ensuring that authority is perceived as legitimate. Watching the two arguments unfold side by side revealed something interesting about the political identities of both figures. Hegseth consistently returned to the language of duty, security, and responsibility toward the officers tasked with enforcing federal law. Clinton consistently returned to the language of legitimacy, stability, and the political consequences that follow when federal authority is exercised without broad consensus. Neither set of concerns is trivial, and both are deeply embedded in American political tradition. The difficulty arises when events unfold quickly enough that leaders must decide which concern takes priority in the moment. At this stage in the discussion, another issue entered the conversation that pushed the debate into even more controversial territory. The cost of the federal deployment began to receive attention, with critics asking whether resources devoted to stabilizing one city might divert funding from programs intended to support service members and their families. Budgetary concerns often appear technical, but in political debates they frequently serve as a proxy for larger disagreements about priorities. If taxpayers are spending hundreds of millions of dollars on a deployment, critics argue the public deserves to know whether that spending is justified. Supporters respond that the cost of failing to maintain order can ultimately be far higher than the cost of acting decisively. Hegseth addressed the question of funding by emphasizing that the primary responsibility of defense and security institutions is protecting the safety of citizens and the officers enforcing national law. He argued that framing the issue purely in terms of financial trade-offs risks ignoring the real consequences that emerge when public safety deteriorates. Cities facing sustained unrest can experience economic damage, community displacement, and long-term declines in public trust that are far more expensive than any single deployment. From his viewpoint, the relevant question is not how much restoring order costs, but how much instability costs if leaders refuse to act. That framing allowed him to shift the debate away from the immediate budget number and toward the broader concept of security as a public good. Clinton did not dispute that security carries a price, but she returned again to the issue of balance and long-term governance. She argued that repeated federal interventions risk creating a cycle in which local governments gradually become less responsible for managing their own crises. If Washington steps in every time tensions escalate, local leaders may find themselves under less pressure to develop solutions tailored to their own communities. Clinton suggested that sustainable governance requires encouraging local institutions to remain accountable for the conditions within their jurisdictions. Otherwise, the federal government may find itself responding to the same problems again and again without addressing their underlying causes. The debate had now moved well beyond the narrow technical questions that originally triggered the discussion. It had evolved into a broader conversation about how leadership should function in a federal system where authority is divided, but responsibilities often overlap. Hegseth's argument emphasized the urgency of enforcement and the moral obligation to protect officers carrying out federal law. Clinton's argument emphasized the importance of legitimacy and the risks that come with exercising authority in ways that appear dismissive of local governance. Both perspectives offered a coherent logic, which is exactly why the exchange remained unresolved. At this point, one could almost sense the audience dividing along familiar political lines depending on which principle resonated more strongly with their own instincts about government. Some viewers were persuaded by Hegseth's insistence that laws mean little if officers cannot enforce them safely. Others were persuaded by Clinton's warning that legitimacy and public trust can erode quickly if federal authority appears heavy-handed. And because both concerns reflect genuine features of democratic governance, the debate did not produce a simple conclusion. Instead, it revealed how complicated the balance between authority and accountability becomes when political conflict intersects with public safety. But the most revealing moment of the entire exchange was still ahead, because the conversation soon turned to the legal foundation behind the deployment itself. A specific provision of federal law was introduced into the discussion, and critics believed it offered a technical argument that could challenge Hegseth's position directly. What happened next transformed the debate from a philosophical disagreement into a very pointed legal confrontation. And the way each side handled that moment exposed even more about the strategic instincts guiding both Pete Hegseth and Hillary Clinton. Understanding that confrontation is essential if you want to see why the debate captured so much attention in the first place. The moment the conversation shifted from philosophy to law was when the atmosphere in the room changed again, because debates about political judgment can remain abstract, but debates about legal authority force everyone involved to take a clear position. At that point in the exchange, critics of the federal deployment began pointing directly to the legal framework governing the use of National Guard and federal forces within the United States. One particular statute became the focal point of the discussion because it outlines the circumstances under which the federal government can mobilize military resources to enforce domestic law or support civil authorities. Those provisions exist precisely because the framers of the Constitution understood that situations might arise where federal authority must intervene when local governance breaks down. But the law also reflects a deep historical caution about the use of military power inside American cities. Hillary Clinton recognized immediately that this legal angle could shift the debate into terrain where procedural arguments carry enormous weight. Instead of debating whether federal intervention was morally justified or politically necessary, she redirected attention to the specific conditions outlined in federal law for deploying forces domestically. Her point was simple but strategically powerful. If the law requires coordination with state leadership under certain circumstances, then bypassing that coordination risks undermining the legal foundation of the deployment itself. In other words, the debate was no longer only about judgment, but about whether the statutory threshold had truly been met. Pete Hegseth responded in a way that revealed his instinct for reframing legal debates in broader political terms. Rather than focusing narrowly on the procedural wording of the statute, he emphasized the practical conditions that existed on the ground at the time the decision was made. According to his argument, the law provides federal authority in situations where state leadership is unable or unwilling to enforce national law effectively. He suggested that the conditions in the city had reached exactly that point, where federal officers tasked with immigration enforcement were facing organized interference and even direct confrontation. From his perspective, that situation represented not a theoretical legal debate, but a concrete breakdown of law enforcement authority. Observers who later reviewed the exchange noticed something interesting about the rhetorical styles of both participants. Clinton spoke the language of statutes, institutional procedure, and constitutional balance, drawing on decades of experience navigating legal frameworks inside government. Hegseth spoke the language of operational reality, focusing on what officers were facing in real time rather than on how lawyers might interpret the statute afterward. Both approaches have deep roots in American political culture. One emphasizes the importance of institutional restraint and legal precision, while the other emphasizes decisive action when security conditions deteriorate. As the legal discussion continued, the statute itself became the center of the confrontation. The law identifies several conditions under which the federal government may deploy forces domestically, including circumstances involving rebellion, obstruction of federal law, or situations where state authorities are unable to maintain order. Critics of the deployment argued that none of those thresholds had been clearly demonstrated in this case. They insisted that the federal government had interpreted the law too broadly in order to justify an aggressive response to a volatile political situation. Supporters argued that the interference faced by immigration officers constituted exactly the type of obstruction the statute was designed to address. The exchange between Hegseth and Clinton became more pointed as each side attempted to define what qualifies as a genuine breakdown of law enforcement authority. Clinton suggested that local tensions, protests, and political resistance do not automatically meet the legal standard for federal intervention. American cities have experienced waves of protest throughout their history, and responding to those tensions often requires political negotiation rather than immediate federal escalation. From her perspective, the danger lies in normalizing federal intervention whenever local conflicts become politically inconvenient. Such a precedent, she warned, could erode the principle of local governance that lies at the heart of the federal system. Hegseth countered by emphasizing that the situation being discussed was not merely a political disagreement or a peaceful demonstration. He argued that federal immigration officers had encountered organized groups attempting to physically block enforcement operations. When law enforcement officers are prevented from carrying out their duties through intimidation or violence, he argued, the situation moves beyond political expression into the realm of unlawful obstruction. In that scenario, the federal government has not only the authority but the obligation to ensure that federal law remains enforceable. For Hegseth, failing to respond would signal that local resistance can override national authority. This moment exposed the deeper philosophical divide underlying the entire conversation. Clinton's argument reflected a long-standing concern within American political thought about the dangers of concentrating too much enforcement authority at the federal level. History offers numerous examples of federal interventions that later became controversial because they appeared to bypass local democratic processes. Her caution reflected a belief that the legitimacy of federal power depends heavily on how carefully it is exercised. Hegseth's argument reflected an equally powerful tradition emphasizing the supremacy of national law when local authorities refuse to uphold it. The tension between those traditions is not new. In fact, it has shaped some of the most consequential constitutional debates in American history. During the Civil Rights era, for example, federal intervention was necessary to enforce court rulings when certain states resisted desegregation orders. At other times, critics have argued that federal authorities acted too aggressively in situations that might have been resolved through local political negotiation. The difficulty lies in determining which category a particular situation belongs to in the moment it occurs. As the legal debate unfolded, viewers could see how each participant attempted to frame the narrative for a broader national audience. Clinton presented herself as a defender of institutional balance and constitutional caution. Hegseth presented himself as a defender of law enforcement officers and the principle that federal law cannot be selectively enforced depending on local political preferences. Both narratives resonate with different segments of the American electorate, and the intensity of the immigration debate means those narratives often collide in dramatic ways during public discussions like this one. The conversation also touched briefly on the symbolism of federal force being visible in American cities. Clinton argued that the presence of military personnel in domestic environments carries a powerful psychological message, one that can influence how communities perceive their relationship with the federal government. She warned that images of armed personnel deployed in urban neighborhoods can deepen mistrust even when the deployment has a legal justification. Hegseth responded by emphasizing that the presence of federal forces can also reassure communities that the government is capable of maintaining order when local authorities struggle to do so. In his view, the symbolism cuts both ways depending on whether citizens feel protected or intimidated by that presence. By the end of this segment of the debate, it was clear that neither side was going to persuade the other through legal interpretation alone. The disagreement had become a reflection of two broader philosophies about governance in a federal democracy. One philosophy prioritizes institutional caution and the preservation of local authority whenever possible. The other prioritizes the immediate enforceability of national law and the protection of officers tasked with carrying it out. Both claim to defend the Constitution, but they emphasize different principles within it. And that is precisely why the exchange between Pete Hegseth and Hillary Clinton captured so much attention among viewers who follow American politics closely. It was not simply a disagreement about one deployment decision or one legal statute. It was a vivid demonstration of how different leaders interpret the responsibilities of power when national authority intersects with local political realities. Understanding that tension is essential to understanding why immigration enforcement debates remain so intense in the United States. Because beneath every argument about policy lies a deeper argument about the meaning of authority itself. By the time the legal argument settled into a tense stalemate, the conversation inside the room began to shift towards something even more politically sensitive. Because once lawmakers and analysts exhaust the statute books, the debate usually returns to the question that sits beneath every policy dispute in Washington. Who actually bears responsibility when institutions fail to maintain order in a way that satisfies both the law and the public's expectations? That question is uncomfortable precisely because it forces political figures to move beyond procedural language and address the consequences of leadership decisions in real time. Pete Hegseth appeared willing to confront that discomfort directly, while Hillary Clinton approached it with the careful framing of someone who understands how quickly a political statement can ripple through national media. And that difference in instinct became increasingly visible as the exchange moved forward. Hegseth shifted the focus away from the legal text and back toward what he described as the practical reality facing officers attempting to enforce immigration law in volatile environments. He argued that debates about procedure often emerge only after situations have already deteriorated to the point where decisive action becomes unavoidable. In his view, the public rarely sees the earlier moments when warnings accumulate and tensions escalate before the federal government intervenes. Those early signals often disappear from the conversation once cameras arrive, and political narratives begin to form. Hegseth suggested that judging enforcement decisions without acknowledging that buildup can distort the public's understanding of what actually occurred. Clinton responded by reminding the audience that leadership also involves anticipating how actions will be interpreted beyond the immediate operational context. A deployment that seems justified to those managing security conditions on the ground can appear very different to communities already skeptical of federal authority. Public perception, she argued, is not a superficial concern, but a central component of democratic governance. If large segments of the public begin to view enforcement decisions as politically motivated rather than legally necessary, trust in institutions erodes rapidly, and once that erosion begins, it becomes extraordinarily difficult to reverse. This exchange highlighted a recurring theme in modern political conflicts, particularly those involving immigration enforcement and federal authority. One side tends to frame the issue primarily as a matter of law and order, emphasizing the obligation of government to enforce national statutes consistently. The other side emphasizes the broader political environment in which those statutes are enforced, arguing that legitimacy and public trust are essential to the effectiveness of any policy. Both perspectives are grounded in legitimate concerns, but they often collide when events unfold faster than consensus can form. That collision was evident in the way both Hegseth and Clinton continued pressing their arguments. At one point in the discussion, Hegseth made a remark that drew particular attention from observers following the debate. He suggested that the real danger in situations like the one under discussion is not federal intervention itself, but the normalization of selective enforcement. If federal law can be obstructed or ignored in certain jurisdictions without consequence, he argued, then the authority of the law begins to erode everywhere else. The Constitution establishes a system in which federal law is meant to apply uniformly across the country. Allowing local resistance to determine where enforcement occurs undermines that principle. Clinton did not dispute the importance of consistent law enforcement, but she cautioned against framing the issue as if local governments were intentionally undermining national authority. Cities face complex political and social pressures that cannot always be resolved through enforcement alone. Local leaders must navigate public protests, community concerns, and political divisions while still maintaining public safety. Interpreting every local disagreement as deliberate obstruction risks oversimplifying situations that require careful negotiation rather than confrontation. For Clinton, leadership involves acknowledging those complexities rather than dismissing them. The conversation became even more layered when the topic of political messaging entered the discussion. In modern American politics, enforcement decisions rarely remain confined to their operational purpose. They quickly become symbols within a broader narrative about immigration, sovereignty, and national identity. Hegseth argued that this symbolic dimension often discourages officials from acting decisively because they fear political backlash more than operational failure. When leaders begin prioritizing narrative management over enforcement responsibility, he suggested, the credibility of institutions suffers. Clinton countered that narrative management is not merely political theater, but an unavoidable aspect of governing a diverse democratic society. Leaders must consider how their actions resonate with communities that may already feel marginalized or distrustful of federal authority. Ignoring those perceptions does not eliminate them. It often amplifies them. In a country as large and diverse as the United States, policy decisions inevitably carry symbolic meaning beyond their immediate practical purpose. Responsible leadership, she argued, requires acknowledging that reality rather than dismissing it. Watching the exchange unfold, one could see how both participants were appealing to different instincts within the American electorate. Hegseth's message resonated with voters who believe the federal government must demonstrate strength and clarity when enforcing national law. Those voters often view hesitation as a sign that institutions are losing the confidence to carry out their responsibilities. Clinton's message resonated with voters who worry that aggressive enforcement actions can deepen political divisions and damage long-term institutional legitimacy. Those voters often see caution and consultation as essential components of democratic leadership. The tension between those instincts explains why debates about immigration enforcement so often become proxies for larger arguments about the direction of the country itself. To some Americans, the issue represents a test of whether national sovereignty and the rule of law remain meaningful principles. To others, it represents a test of whether the country can enforce its laws without abandoning the values of inclusion and fairness that many believe define the American ideal. Neither interpretation is purely rhetorical. Both reflect genuine fears about the consequences of political decisions. And that is why exchanges like this one tend to resonate far beyond the immediate policy question. As the discussion progressed, a moment of unexpected humor briefly cut through the tension in the room. When one participant remarked that Washington sometimes produces more debates than solutions, a few observers chuckled quietly, recognizing the familiar truth behind the comment. Even Clinton allowed herself a brief smile at the remark, acknowledging that political institutions can become trapped in cycles of argument, while real-world problems continue to evolve. Hegseth responded with a light remark of his own, noting that if debates alone solved policy challenges, Congress would have resolved the immigration issue decades ago. The humor was brief, but it revealed that even the sharpest political disagreements can occasionally pause long enough for a shared recognition of the system's imperfections. But the underlying disagreement remained unresolved, and both participants returned quickly to the serious implications of the debate. Hegseth emphasized that enforcement credibility is the foundation upon which any immigration reform must ultimately rest. Without confidence that existing laws will be applied consistently, public support for broader reforms becomes difficult to sustain. Clinton emphasized that sustainable reform must address the humanitarian realities driving migration, as well as the institutional processes governing enforcement. Ignoring either dimension risks creating policies that satisfy political rhetoric without solving the underlying problem. By the end of this phase of the discussion, it had become clear that the disagreement between Pete Hegseth and Hillary Clinton was not simply about a deployment decision or a specific legal statute. It reflected two distinct philosophies about how authority should operate in a democratic system confronted with complex challenges. One philosophy emphasizes decisive enforcement and the primacy of national law. The other emphasizes institutional balance, political legitimacy, and the careful management of public trust. And the tension between those philosophies continues to shape the national conversation about immigration and governance. By the time the conversation reached this stage, the debate had evolved into something much broader than the initial question about enforcement authority or a single deployment decision. What was unfolding in front of the audience was essentially a clash between two political instincts that have shaped American policy debates for decades. Pete Hegseth continued to emphasize the idea that a government which hesitates to enforce its own laws risks undermining the very legitimacy critics claim to protect. Hillary Clinton continued to stress that legitimacy itself is fragile, and actions taken without careful political judgment can weaken institutions even when those actions are legally justified. The more they spoke, the clearer it became that neither argument could be easily dismissed because both addressed genuine tensions within democratic governance. Hegseth pushed the discussion toward the practical implications of failing to enforce federal law consistently across the country. He argued that when local jurisdictions openly resist cooperation with federal immigration enforcement, the message that reaches the public is one of fragmentation rather than unity. If national laws exist, but are effectively optional depending on the political orientation of a city or state, then the authority of those laws inevitably becomes weaker. For Hegseth, the issue was not merely about immigration policy, but about the long-term credibility of the federal government itself. A government that cannot enforce its own statutes eventually invites challenges from actors who believe those statutes no longer carry real consequences. Clinton responded with a reminder that credibility also depends on the perception that power is exercised responsibly and proportionally. The United States has always struggled to balance enforcement authority with the constitutional protections that safeguard civil liberties and local governance. In moments of political tension, it can be tempting for national leaders to prioritize swift action over careful coordination. But history, she suggested, shows that decisions made in the heat of political conflict often produce unintended consequences that linger long after the crisis has passed. Leadership requires resisting the temptation to reduce complicated problems to simple narratives of strength versus weakness. One of the most revealing moments of this phase of the discussion came when the conversation turned toward the broader political consequences of enforcement debates. Immigration policy in the United States is rarely confined to administrative decisions within government agencies. It quickly becomes a defining symbol in national political campaigns, shaping how voters interpret questions of sovereignty, identity, and economic opportunity. Hegseth acknowledged that symbolism, but argued that avoiding decisive action out of fear of political controversy creates its own set of risks. If leaders allow public safety concerns to become secondary to political messaging, the public eventually loses faith in the institutions meant to protect them. Clinton countered that political messaging cannot simply be dismissed as an inconvenience because public trust in institutions depends heavily on how those institutions communicate with the people they serve. Policies implemented without careful explanation can easily be interpreted as partisan maneuvers rather than necessary governance decisions. Once that perception spreads, Even legitimate enforcement actions may be viewed with suspicion by communities already wary of federal authority. In a democracy, perception often shapes reality just as much as formal legal authority does. Ignoring that dynamic, she argued, risks creating deeper divisions instead of resolving them. The discussion also touched briefly on the international dimension of immigration policy, an issue Clinton has frequently emphasized throughout her career. Migration flows are rarely driven by a single factor, and they often reflect economic instability, political violence, and environmental crises in regions far beyond American borders. Clinton suggested that focusing exclusively on enforcement at the border may address immediate pressures without addressing the deeper causes driving migration in the first place. Long-term stability, she argued, requires diplomatic engagement and economic cooperation with countries experiencing those pressures. Otherwise, the United States will continue facing recurring surges of migration, regardless of enforcement strategy. Hegseth acknowledged the complexity of international factors, but argued that domestic policy still determines how effectively the United States responds when those pressures reach its borders. While international diplomacy can address root causes over time, enforcement policy determines whether existing immigration laws retain practical meaning in the present. From his perspective, discussions about long-term global solutions should not become an excuse for ignoring immediate enforcement responsibilities. The government's first obligation, he argued, is to ensure that the laws currently on the books are respected and enforceable. Only after that credibility is established can broader reforms gain the public support necessary to succeed. At this point in the exchange, the debate began to take on a slightly different tone, one that revealed how deeply personal political philosophy can shape interpretations of the same set of facts. Hegseth's remarks often reflected the perspective of someone who views government authority primarily through the lens of security and responsibility. Clinton's remarks reflected the perspective of someone who has spent decades navigating international diplomacy and institutional politics, where perception and legitimacy carry enormous weight. Both perspectives arise from real experience, which is why neither side found it easy to concede ground. Instead, the conversation continued circling the same fundamental tension between decisive action and institutional caution. A brief moment of levity appeared again when one observer noted that American politics has a remarkable ability to transform every policy debate into a broader philosophical argument. Clinton responded with a light remark that perhaps this tendency is inevitable in a country founded on arguments about the meaning of law and liberty. Hegseth smiled and replied that debates about philosophy might be inevitable. But eventually, someone still has to make a decision when officers on the ground are waiting for guidance. The exchange drew a few quiet laughs, but it also illustrated the deeper point that theory and action often move at different speeds in government, and political leaders must constantly navigate the tension between them. As the discussion approached its final phase, both participants seemed aware that the audience was not simply listening for a policy answer, but evaluating competing visions of leadership. Hegseth's vision emphasized clarity, decisiveness, and the principle that law must remain enforceable regardless of political controversy. Clinton's vision emphasized restraint, institutional balance, and the importance of maintaining public trust even during moments of crisis. Neither vision can fully succeed without elements of the other. Yet political debate often forces them into opposition rather than synthesis. That dynamic is one reason immigration policy remains one of the most persistent sources of conflict in American politics. The unresolved tension between those two approaches set the stage for the final moments of the exchange, when the conversation moved away from immediate policy details and toward a more reflective question about the future direction of the country's immigration debate. Both Hegseth and Clinton understood that the issues they were discussing would not disappear after a single hearing or news cycle. Immigration will continue to shape elections, legislative battles, and national identity debates for years to come. The real question was not who had won the argument that day, but how the country would reconcile the competing principles both sides claimed to defend. And the answer to that question would determine how the debate evolves long after the cameras stop recording. As the discussion reached its closing moments, the tone in the room shifted from confrontation toward reflection, because both Pete Hegseth and Hillary Clinton understood that the issue they had been debating could not be resolved in a single exchange. Immigration policy, federal authority, and the balance between enforcement and legitimacy are questions that have challenged American leaders for generations. What the audience had witnessed was not merely a disagreement between two political figures, but a demonstration of the deeper philosophical divide that continues to shape national politics. Hegseth's arguments reflected a conviction that the credibility of government begins with the consistent enforcement of law. Clinton's arguments reflected a conviction that the durability of institutions depends on the careful and measured exercise of that authority. Hegseth used his final remarks to return to what he described as the fundamental responsibility of leadership in moments of instability. He argued that laws passed by Congress carry meaning only if those charged with enforcing them have the confidence that their government will stand behind them when challenges arise. When officers encounter organized resistance or obstruction while attempting to enforce federal statutes, hesitation from national leadership can send a damaging signal. It suggests that enforcement may depend more on political calculations than on the rule of law itself. For Hegseth, the strength of the American system lies in its willingness to uphold legal principles even when doing so generates political controversy. Clinton responded by reminding the audience that strength in democratic governance is not measured solely by the willingness to act, but also by the wisdom to act in ways that preserve public trust. The legitimacy of institutions is built over time through a combination of law, transparency, and respect for the diverse communities affected by government decisions. A policy that appears decisive in the short term can sometimes weaken that legitimacy if it is perceived as dismissive of local voices or constitutional balance. Clinton argued that leadership must consider the long-term stability of institutions as carefully as it considers the immediate pressures of a crisis. That perspective reflects a belief that durable solutions require both authority and restraint. One of the most interesting aspects of the debate was how clearly it illustrated the tension between these two philosophies of leadership. Hegseth's approach speaks to voters who believe that government institutions have become too hesitant, too cautious, and too concerned with political messaging when confronting difficult challenges. Those voters often see decisive enforcement as evidence that leaders are willing to take responsibility for maintaining order. Clinton's approach resonates with voters who fear that aggressive government action can erode civil liberties and undermine the delicate balance of power that defines the American constitutional system. Those voters see caution not as weakness, but as a safeguard against the overreach of authority. The exchange also revealed how immigration policy has evolved into one of the central fault lines in contemporary American politics. Debates about the border, enforcement authority, and federal intervention now serve as proxies for broader questions about national identity, economic opportunity, and the meaning of sovereignty. Some Americans view immigration primarily through the lens of humanitarian responsibility and global interconnectedness. Others view it primarily through the lens of national security and the rule of law. Those perspectives are not mutually exclusive, but political debates often present them as competing visions of the country's future. Hegseth acknowledged that complexity when he suggested that enforcement and compassion should not be treated as opposing values. A nation can welcome legal immigration and maintain humanitarian commitments while still insisting that its laws be respected. From his viewpoint, the real danger arises when the political system loses the ability to distinguish between lawful migration and situations where enforcement mechanisms are undermined. If that distinction disappears, public confidence in the immigration system itself begins to erode. And once public confidence erodes, meaningful reform becomes far more difficult to achieve. Clinton agreed that reform requires public confidence, but she emphasized that such confidence also depends on demonstrating fairness and consistency in the application of policy. Communities must believe that enforcement actions are guided by law rather than by political calculation or symbolic gestures designed for media attention. That belief, she argued, requires leaders to communicate clearly about the reasoning behind their decisions and to remain accountable for the consequences of those decisions. Transparency and institutional integrity are essential components of democratic governance. Without them, even well-intentioned policies can generate suspicion and division. By this point, it was clear that neither participant expected the other to abandon their position. Instead, the final moments of the discussion served as a reminder that democratic debate often functions less as a search for immediate agreement and more as a process through which competing ideas are tested in public view. The audience listening to the exchange was not merely observing a disagreement between two individuals. They were witnessing the ongoing negotiation between different visions of leadership that continue to shape the country's political landscape. And those visions will continue to influence policy long after the debate itself ends. Before the discussion concluded, Clinton made one final observation that seemed intended to bring the conversation back to a broader perspective. She noted that American democracy has always been defined by its ability to absorb intense political disagreements without abandoning the principles that allow those disagreements to occur peacefully. Debates about immigration, enforcement, and federal authority may become heated, but they also demonstrate the openness of a system in which policies can be questioned, defended, and revised through public dialogue. That process, she suggested, remains one of the country's greatest strengths. It allows competing ideas to confront one another without resorting to force. Hegseth responded by agreeing that open debate is essential, but added that debate must eventually produce decisions. Government cannot function indefinitely as a forum for argument without also acting on the responsibilities entrusted to it by voters. Leaders must ultimately choose a course of action and accept accountability for the results of that choice. In his view, the health of democratic institutions depends not only on the freedom to debate, but also on the courage to implement policies once those debates have occurred. Action and accountability must follow discussion if governance is to remain effective. As the session finally drew to a close, it was evident that the disagreement between Pete Hegseth and Hillary Clinton had illuminated more than a single policy question. It had revealed the enduring tension between decisive authority and institutional restraint, between the urgency of enforcement and the patience of diplomacy. Those tensions are woven into the fabric of the American political system, and they ensure that debates about immigration and federal authority will continue for years to come. Neither perspective offered a simple solution to the challenges being discussed, but together they illustrated the complexity of governing a nation as large and diverse as the United States. The audience left with more than just the memory of a heated exchange. They left with a deeper understanding of the philosophical questions that lie beneath many of the country's most contentious policy debates. How should a democracy balance the need for decisive leadership with the responsibility to preserve institutional legitimacy? When should federal authority override local autonomy, and when should it step back in deference to community governance? Those questions remain unresolved, and they will continue to shape the national conversation long after this particular debate fades from the headlines.